Today is a pretty historic day in this Parliament and for Victoria. We will be repealing the Sex Work Act today, and that will effectively decriminalise sex work in Victoria. This has been a campaign that really started in the early 1980s, and we have seen iterations of legislation designed to control and effectively stigmatise sex workers. But now we have legislation currently in place that is not fit for purpose. It doesn't work on any meaningful level. It doesn't protect anyone. In fact, it does quite the opposite. It's not even effective in keeping people to work in a legal system. In fact, probably the majority of the sex industry in Victoria operates outside the current controls. So this is a historic day. It is a day that sex workers have been campaigning for relentlessly. This is a day when consensual sex between two consenting adults will not be controlled through the sex work law. This is a decriminalisation of sex work. The other important aspect of the bill before us today is not only it repeals the Act, but it introduces a new protected attribute to the Human Rights Charter in Victoria. And that is an attribute to protect sex workers from discrimination on the grounds of their occupation, their trade or their calling. We know that stigma kills. We know that the discrimination that is experienced by people in the sex industry is profound. It profoundly affects their family, it profoundly affects their work, it profoundly affects their health, and it makes people vulnerable to violence, and it makes it difficult to report. So I am so proud to have played a role in this historic day, and we will now see legislation that treats sex work as work. Thanks. Someone else?
Thanks, Fiona. This is a momentous day for Victorian sex workers. Sex workers have been fighting for these changes for absolutely decades, and we welcome this bill. For the first time in Victoria, sex work will no longer be treated as a crime. It will be treated as a legitimate business, and sex work will be recognised as work. We welcome the bill, and we hope that the upper house will pass this bill tonight.
So what does the changes mean practically for you? What will be different for you now?
The number one benefit for sex workers is that we will no longer have to fear the police if something goes wrong at work. If we're the victim of a crime, right now, we can't report that crime to police. This bill will enable us to do so safely, like any other worker in Victoria.
And how often have you felt unsafe at work? Is that something that you felt before?
Well, fortunately, violence is not common, but violence can occur in any workplace, and all workers really need the option of reporting problems when something goes wrong.
Can I just get you to say your name, please?
My name is Matthew Roberts, and I'm a spokesperson for Sex Work Law Reform Victoria.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Dylan O'Hara. I'm the Acting Manager of Vixen, Victoria's peer-only sex worker organisation. Look, this is a huge day for our community and, really a huge achievement for sex workers. At the moment, in Victoria, sex workers are forced to make decisions in our work based on the requirements of a really discriminatory, harmful set of laws rather than based on our working safety. And so this is a huge day. I guess I want to add, though, that while this is a huge step forward, there are areas of the bill that do need strengthening to ensure that all sex workers in Victoria can enjoy the benefits of decriminalisation and have access to the justice system should we desire it or need it, access to the services that we need, freedom from fear of policing and arrest. Really there's a lot at stake today for Victorian sex workers.
Can you give us an idea of just how long this conversation has been going on and what that is, I suppose, the level of the milestone for the community?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, pick a number, decades and decades, years and years and years. You know, sex workers in Victoria have been, and across Australia have been loud and clear for so many years that full decriminalisation of our work is the only approach that upholds our rights, that actually supports our rights in the workplace in terms of work health and safety. And yeah, as I said, sex workers in Victoria are also really clear that this has to be for our whole community. We don't want any of our community left behind in this process.
Why do you think it's taken so long for the Parliament to become receptive to reforms like this?
Look, I think that's a complicated question. I think there's a lot of stigma that surrounds sex work. Also, the laws in Victoria currently produce that stigma. They're based in stigma, and so they produce more stigma and discrimination. So I think that's definitely part of it. Might jump over to you, Jules.
Yeah,
Sorry,
Dylan, can I just ask around the strengthening of the laws?
Sure.
Migrant workers, they're not included. Is it
So
migrant workers?
I'm referring to the amendments that Andy Medic is bringing. So I'm particularly referring to the fact that the bill does retain some criminalisation of street-based sex workers, which I think is really a missed opportunity for Victoria today if the government doesn't go all the way and ensure that all sex workers are included in this. And there are a number of other areas as well that Vixen and Scarlett Alliance have consulted with Andy on in his amendment. So yeah, we'll be looking to those today.
What are the areas of the bill that you feel like need strengthening and why?
Sure. So as I mentioned around street-based sex work, we would also like to see, in addition to the attribute that is being introduced to the Equal Opportunity Act around profession, occupation and trade, we'd also like to see sex work and sex worker as protected attributes. Sex workers experience really profound levels of stigma and discrimination across all facets of our lives, so we really need robust anti-discrimination protections to ensure we actually have redress when that happens. Jules, do you want to speak to a couple of the other areas perhaps?
Sure. So can we just get your name and the name
Sure. My name's Dylan O'Hara. I'm the acting manager of Vixen, Victoria's peer sex worker organisation.
What, just the spelling of Dylan?
DYLAN.
Perfect, thank you.
My pronouns are they and them, please.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Jules Kim. I'm a sex worker and the CEO of Scarlett Alliance, which is the Australian Sex Workers Association. Now, decriminalisation of sex work is recognised as the best model of sex industry regulation. And this isn't just us, the sex workers, calling for this. This is like evidence from Amnesty International from a human rights perspective, the International Labour Organisation from a work health and safety perspective, from the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women and Children, from a labour rights for all sex workers, including those experiencing exploitation or trafficking, and also from the United Nations. UNAIDS recognises that it's necessary for public health. And the WHO, the World Health Organization, has made a technical recommendation to say that from a health perspective, decriminalisation of sex work is the best model of sex industry regulation. So they're not making a judgment about whether they support or reject the sex industry. It's just that the evidence is clear that this is the model that is going to result in the best outcomes in relation to safety, justice, health, from every other perspective, and the human rights of sex workers.
One of the crossbench MPs, they're seeking to introduce an amendment to the bill that will make it an offence for prohibited persons, i.e. serious criminals, from owning or managing a brothel. What's your response to that?
Well, look, I think that, the intent of decriminalisation is not to introduce any specific legislation. There are already these frameworks in place for other businesses, and it's about treating sex industry businesses as a business. So it's not requiring specific laws just for the sex industry, and often these are based on myths and stereotypes and based on fear. And a lot of the speeches that we've heard already have kind of really not actually based their arguments in evidence, but on fear, knee-jerk reactions to fear and this kind of perception that somehow, because sex work's decriminalised, that everyone's going to want to start sex working, that somehow there's going to be, a massive increase in the size of the sex industry. That's just not the case. And they think that it means that there's going to be sex workers standing on every street. That is just the evidence shows that it just doesn't
Bit
happen.
of wishful thinking there.
Yeah, and a pretty bad business model for
Very,
sex
that's
workers. So, we don't stand outside schools, we don't stand outside churches. It just doesn't happen. There's no need to make special regulations. And in fact, what it does is create more barriers to sex workers seeking to access justice and seeking to access their sports.
What about what happened when sex workers took criminalised in the Northern Territory? Like, did anything other than the rights of protection change up there?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. In the Northern Territory, when sex work was fully decriminalised, it just meant that sex workers were able to access the labour protections that were accessible to other workers. It meant that we were able to institute work health and safety protocols in our workplaces. And if we were experienced a victim of a crime, that we were able to go to the police without fear of being arrested just for being a sex worker.
Those that are concerned, there's been concerns raised about that it would be easier to be opening up certain areas who may not have the challenges next door to their own home, that sort of thing.
Yeah, look, again, that's such a myth, it just hasn't been borne out by the evidence. And as we know, it's during the pandemic and the environment that we're in now, it's not easy for anyone to open any business, it's just not the case. We've had decriminalisation in New South Wales. It's the first place in the world to decriminalise sex work in 1995. And this bill goes further, which we're really pleased about. And there are a lot of great elements about this bill. But unfortunately, there are a few amendments that we're seeking. But we're very excited, and it's really going to make a huge difference in the lives of sex workers.
Does this go the furthest in the country? I know we're talking about the Northern Territory as well. Is this sort of the best case scenario at this point? Victoria, be leading the way here?
Well, we hope so once the amendments are passed. Yeah.
And obviously Dylan mentioned a couple of amendments
Sure.
that they want to introduce.
Sure.
Is there anything else that you feel like needs to be introduced?
Yeah, we're hoping for the destruction of the register, and the government. We're really pleased that the government is seeking to remove the registration requirements for individual sex workers, and those requirements can never be removed even after you die. You can never get those records removed, and they continue to have material impacts on sex workers' lives. What we're asking for is those records to then be destroyed.
Immediately.
Can you maybe talk about the material impact of having that register?
Yeah, look, there's still moral turpitude clauses in a lot of countries, and sex work is criminalised in most places around the world. So if you're a sex worker, theoretically you can't travel to the US, and there's been many sex workers who have been blocked from entering the US, even when they were going there just for a holiday. It's impacted sex workers in child custody cases because of the stereotype that if you're a sex worker, then you are therefore a bad parent. And it's impacted sex workers in getting other employment. If they're seeking to leave the sex industry, it's been a real barrier to be able to get other employment. So it's, in so many different ways, it's negatively impacted on sex workers' lives.
How long do you think it will take for a bill with changes like this to change the perspectives that people have on sex work or change the culture?
Yeah, look, it doesn't happen overnight, and we know that stigma and discrimination against sex work doesn't happen overnight, and we're really pleased to see that the government is taking the approach to want to actually have an education campaign, an awareness campaign, and Vixen's now been funded to have outreach workers, peer workers, to assist in the implementation of the reforms. So I think it will make a big difference to have that, to coordinate that approach.